Good morning, and welcome to the 32nd anniversary of the Miami Book Fair. I'm Dr. Nicholas Beza, a volunteer room host, and we're delighted to have you here. If you've looked through the events for today, you'll see that there are an amazing array of events all over this campus. And this is not the end of the Miami-Dade Book Fair. Events are happening all year round, all over the city. So please participate all year round. Also, please consider becoming a member of the Friends of the Book Fair. That's just downstairs in room 310411. Your charitable contribution will support the wonderful book fair. And this year, supporting the book fair is far easier than ever. Just text BOOK, book, to 501-501. That'll donate $10. You'll be asked to confirm. Just reply yes. We're also grateful to our sponsors, including the Knight Foundation, OHL Arellano, and the Batchelor Foundation, and so many more sponsors that you'll see listed all over the fair. After this discussion, there'll be a brief Q&A, and the authors will be autographing books just immediately down the hall and to the right. So now, kindly silence all of your electronic devices, because there are so many these days. Even if you're reading books, make them quiet. And here to introduce our special guest authors today is Robbie Bell. Robbie.
Great and powerful morning to you all. We are going to be enriched. Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to present this morning retired architect Ron Frazier and retired director of pharmacy Regina Jolivet Frazier. They are exceptional community active volunteers in this town. Ron is chairman and CEO of the BAC Funding Corporation and member of the board of Historic Hampton House Community Trust, Inc. And Regina is chairman of the book committee of the Links Incorporated, Greater Miami chapter, my chapter, and liaison to and member of the board of Linkages and Legacies, Inc., which is the publisher of Linkages and Legacies, Volumes 1 and 2. These are historical profiles depicting notable Greater Miami, Florida pioneers of African descent. It gives me great pleasure to introduce the Links Incorporated 9th National President and her husband, Mr. and Mrs. Ron Frazier.
Good morning and welcome. We are excited to present to you a major participant in the civil rights history of this nation, United States Representative John Lewis from Georgia's 5th Congressional District. Congressman Lewis is a man of integrity, one of the most courageous leaders the civil rights movement has ever produced.
Born a sharecropper's son on February 21st, 1940, outside of rural Troy, Alabama, he lived on the family farm and attended segregated public schools in Pike County, Alabama. Inspired by the activism surrounding the Montgomery boycott and in the words of Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. that he heard on the radio, he decided to join the movement. Ever since, he's remained a vanguard of progressive social movements and the human rights and voting struggles. Congressman Lewis is the subject author or co-author of numerous texts. Most notably, he has co-authored the #1 New York Times best-selling graphic novel series, March.
Book 1 was released in 2013. Book 2 was released this year and immediately became a New York Times bestseller. Congressman Lewis is the recipient of numerous awards, including the Medal of Freedom from President Barack Obama, the NAACP Spingarn Medal, the Capitol Award of the National Council of La Raza, and the only John F. Kennedy Profile in Courage Award for Lifetime Achievement. And now, as you sit at his feet, please listen and learn from an insider's perspective about March. But first, stand up and give a rousing ovation to one of the finest citizens this nation has to offer. Ladies and gentlemen, the Honorable John Lewis and co-author Andrew Aydin, Digital Director and Policy Advisor.
Good morning. I'm delighted, very happy, and very pleased to be here in Miami, the Miami Book Fair, one more time. I want to thank the Link for being involved and part of this effort. Thank you for those kind words of introduction. You heard in the introduction that I didn't grow up in a big city like Miami or Atlanta or Washington or New York or Chicago or Philadelphia. I grew up in rural Alabama, 50 miles from Montgomery, outside of a little place called Troy. My father was a sharecropper, a tenant farmer. But back in 1944, when I was 4 years old, and I do remember when I was 4, how many of you remember when you were 4? You really don't? Well, what happened to the rest of us? My father had saved $300, and a man sold him 110 acres of land for $300. My family still owns this land today. On this farm, we raise a lot of cotton and corn, peanuts, hogs, cows, and chickens. I will be out there working in the field. Let me tell the story in March. Picking cotton, gathering peanuts, pulling corn. And my mother would say, boy, you're falling behind. You need to catch up. And I would say, this is hard work. And she would say, hard work never killed anybody. I said, well, it's about to kill me. So working on that farm, raising those chickens, taught me hard work, discipline, perseverance, to never give up, to never give in, to keep the faith, and to keep my eyes on the prize. Now, some of you no doubt have heard me tell the story. You probably read it in March, that on the farm it was my responsibility to care for the chickens. And I fell in love with raising chickens. Now, I know you're all great readers of books. You love books, but you don't know anything about raising chickens. I know some of you love to eat chicken, but you don't know anything about raising chickens. As a little boy, it was my responsibility, my calling to care for the chickens. So when the setting hen was set, we had to take the fresh eggs, mark them with a pencil, place them under the setting hen, and wait for 3 long weeks for the little chicks to hatch. Some of you may be asking now, John Lewis, why do you mark those fresh eggs with a pencil before you place them under the setting hen? Well, from time to time, another hen would get on that same nest, and there would be some more eggs. And you had to be able to tell the fresh eggs from the eggs that were already under the setting hen. Do you follow me? That's okay. You don't follow me? It's okay. It's all right. So when these little chicks would hatch, I would fool these setting hen. I would cheat on these setting hen. I would take these little chicks and give them to another hen. Put them in a box with a lantern. Get some more fresh eggs, mark them with a pencil, place them under the setting hen, encourage the setting hen to stay in the nest for another 3 weeks. Kept on fooling and cheating on these setting hens. And when I look back on it, it was not the right thing to do. It was not the moral thing to do. It was not the most loving thing to do. It was not the most nonviolent thing to do. It was not the most democratic thing to do. But I was never quite able to save $18.98 to order the most inexpensive incubator or Hatcher from the Sizzle and Roebuck store. Any of you old enough to remember the Sizzle and Roebuck catalog? You really do? That big book, that heavy book, that thick book. Some people call it the ordering book. Some people call it the wish book. I wish I had this. I wish I had that. Well, I just kept on wishing. But as a little child, about 8 or 9 years old, I wanted to be a minister. I wanted to preach the gospel. So from time to time, with the help of my brothers and sisters and cousins, we would gather all of our chickens together in the chicken yard, like you gather here in this hall. My brothers and sisters and cousins will line the outside of the chicken yard, but around the chicken yard. Along with the chickens, they would help make up the audience, the congregation. And I would start speaking or preaching. And when I look back on it, some of these chickens would bow their heads. Some of these chickens would shake their heads. They never quite said amen. But I'm convinced that some of those chickens that I preached to in the 40s and the 50s tended to listen to me much better than some of my colleagues listen to me today in the Congress. As a matter of fact, some of those chickens were just a little more productive. At least they produce eggs. That's enough of that story. Growing up there, when we would visit the little town of Troy, visit Montgomery, visit Tuskegee, I saw those signs that said white men, white women, colored women, white waiting, colored waiting. To go downtown on a Saturday afternoon to see a movie, all of us little black children had to go upstairs to the balcony, and all of the little white children went downstairs to the first floor. I asked my mother, my father, my grandparents, why? They would say, that's the way it is. Don't get in the way. Don't get in trouble. But in 1955, 15 years old in the 10th grade, I heard of Rosa Parks. I heard of the words of Martin Luther King Jr. The action of Rosa Parks, the words and leadership of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. inspired me to find a way to get in the way. I was inspired to get in trouble. And I got in what I call good trouble, necessary trouble. So it's our idea that March, this book 1, book 2, next summer, book 3 will come out, will inspire another generation of young people and people not so young to stand up, to speak up and speak out and get in good trouble, necessary trouble, to help change our country and make our society and make our world a little bit better. Some of you may be asking, and we tell the story, how do you meet Rosa Parks? How do you meet Martin Luther King Jr.? Hi. Way in school in Nashville, Tennessee. And Rosa Parks came to speak at a rally at a church, and I met her. But long before then, I applied to go to a little college called Troy State College then, now known as Troy University. Submitted my application, my high school transcript. I never heard a word from the school. It didn't admit black students. So at the age of 17, I wrote a letter to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I didn't tell my mother, my father, any of my sisters or brothers, any of my teachers. And Dr. King wrote me back and sent me a round-trip Greyhound bus ticket and invited me to come to Montgomery to meet with him. September 1957, an uncle of mine gave me a $100 bill, more money than I ever had. Gave me a big trunk, what some of you today probably call, or back then maybe you call a foot locker. One of these big upright trunks that had the drawers, right? That you can open up, bring it back together, had the curtains. I put everything that I own, except those chickens, in that foot locker and took a Greyhound bus to Nashville. And after being in school in Nashville for about 3 weeks, I told one of my teachers that I'd been in contact with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. This teacher knew Dr. King. They both had studied together at Morehouse College in Atlanta. So Dr. King got back in church and suggested when I was home for spring break to come and see him. In March of 1958, 18 years old, home for spring break, took a bus to Montgomery. And a young lawyer, never seen a lawyer before, never met a lawyer before, young man by the name of Fred Gray, who had been the lawyer for Rosa Parks, for Dr. King, the Montgomery movement, and became our lawyer during the Freedom Ride and during the march from Selma to Montgomery. Met me at the Greyhound bus station in downtown Montgomery and drove me to the First Baptist Church, pastored by the Reverend Ralph Abernathy, and ushered me into the pastor's study. I saw Martin Luther King Jr. and Ralph Abernathy standing behind the desk. I was so scared. I didn't know what to say or what to do. And Dr. King said, "Are you the boy from Troy? Are you John Lewis?" And I said, "Dr. King, I am John Robert Lewis." I gave my whole name. And he started calling me the boy from Troy. I went back and had a discussion with my mother and my father. I told them of my meeting with Dr. King and Reverend Ralph Abernathy. That Dr. King had said we may have to file a suit against the State Board of Education, Troy State. But in the process, the home may be bombed or burned. We could lose the land and go back and have a discussion with them. So I decided to continue to study in Nashville. So in Nashville, a group of students from Fisk University, Tennessee State, American Baptist College, Meharry Medical School, Vanderbilt University, and Peabody, black and white college students, started studying the way of peace, the way of love, the way of nonviolence. We studied what Gandhi attempted to accomplish in South Africa, what he accomplished in India. We studied Thoreau in civil disobedience. We studied what Martin Luther King Jr. and the people in Montgomery was all about. And then we started sitting in. Andrew Aydin would tell you that he did a little research, working on March, and discovered that in 1960, after we had been sitting in an orderly, peaceful, nonviolent fashion, waiting to be served, when people would come up and spit on us, put lighted cigarettes out in our hair, down our backs, pour hot water, hot coffee on us. We were so orderly and so peaceful. And then we heard that we may get arrested. And during those days, when I protested, I sort of wanted to look good, sort of put on my Sunday's best. I had very little money. I wanted a new suit if I was going to go to jail. So I went to a used men's store in downtown Nashville and bought a suit. I paid $5 for it. And I tell you, seeing this picture, Andrew, I look fresh. And if I still had that suit today, I probably could sell it on eBay for a lot of money. For a lot of money. My first arrest. During the 60s, I was arrested 40 times. And since being in Congress, 5 more. Now, the last time I got arrested, 2 years ago, October, 2 years ago, it was 200 of us, 8 members of Congress, hundreds of private citizens. We were trying to get the Speaker of the House to pass a bill that the Senate had passed, to bring it to the floor for comprehensive immigration reform. It doesn't make sense to have millions of people living in this country of ours and not providing them citizenship or on a path to citizenship. That's right, that's not fair. In my book, there's no such thing as an illegal human being. As the Pope said, when he spoke to to Congress a few weeks ago. We all are immigrants. We all come from some other place. Now, March tell an unbelievable story. It's not just my story. Just think, a few short years ago, in 1961, the same year that President Barack Obama was born, black people and white people couldn't be seated together on a bus, leaving Washington, D.C., traveling through Virginia, through North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi. We were on our way to New Orleans to test a decision of the United States Supreme Court. 13 of us became part of the original Freedom Ride. I was one of the 13. We went through a period of training for 4 days. The night of May 3rd, 1961, we went to a little Chinese restaurant. Now, growing up in rural Alabama, attending school in Nashville, I never had Chinese food before. We had a wonderful meal. Someone spoke up and said, "You should eat well. This may be like the Last Supper." The next day, some boarded a Trailway bus, some boarded a Greyhound bus. My seatmate was a young white gentleman. The two of us entered a so-called white waiting room, attempted to. In Rock Hill, South Carolina, we were attacked, beaten, and left lying in a pool of blood. We were beaten by members of the Klan. May 1961. But February '09, one of the guys that beat us came to my office. He was in his 70s. His son was in his 40s. He came and said, "Mr. Lewis, I'm one of the people that beat you. I want to apologize. Will you forgive me?" The young son started crying. He started crying. And I said, "I accept your apology. I forgive you." They hugged me. I hugged them back. And the three of us cried together. That is the power of the way of peace, the power of the way of love. That is the power of nonviolence that is moving toward reconciliation. March is saying, in effect, that we must come to that point where we lay down the burden of race. It is saying to future generation that we can create the beloved community. Well, it doesn't matter whether we're black or white, Latino, Asian American, or Native American. We're one people, we're one family, we're one house. We all live in the same house, not just the American house, but the world house. I like to quote a man that was born here in the great state of Florida, A. Philip Randolph. Was born in Jacksonville, Florida. He moved to New York and became a champion of civil rights, human rights, labor rights. And Mr. Randolph was said when the so-called Big Six were meeting, planning the March on Washington, he was said to us sometime, "Maybe our foremothers and our forefathers all came to this great land in different ships, but we all are in the same boat now. That we must look out for each other, care for each other, and try to move closer to the beloved community." Dr. King put it this way: we must learn to live together as brothers and sisters, or we'll perish as fools. Gandhi said it is nonviolence or non-existence. March is saying to another generation, it is possible for us to be a little more human. Just be human. I tell young people all the time, and this is what March is saying, and Andrew is going to speak about it. We have to come to that point where we have the capacity, the ability to forgive. And lay down the burden of division, the burden of separation. I tell young people, never hate. Hate is too heavy a burden to bear. Now, some people ask, why are you so hopeful? Why are you so optimistic? I think it's in my DNA. But it's also what I discovered in school, in life. It's better to love than to hate. It's better to do good than to do evil. Can we come to that point as a human being where we recognize and respect the dignity and the worth of every human being? We want to spread the word. We travel all across America, carrying a good message, the message of hope, the message of love, the message of peace. Now, in my last arrest, I must tell you, I had left my bail money someplace. We'd been told that it was going to be, $50, and I didn't have the money. The Capitol Police that arrested us, they were apologizing, saying, "We just hate to do this, Congressman, but we've been ordered to do it. We want to apologize for arresting you, and it's going to cost $50 to get out of this place." And this young man, my staff person, somehow went in his pocket and found $50 and got me out of the place. And I did repay you, right? Oh, real good. That's right. I'm very, very hopeful about the future. March 1 is out, March 2, March 3, and I'm so sorry that artist, illustrator, is not here. Because this young man is so good. Andrew will tell you. He makes the words sing and dance. And sometimes when he's signing a book, when we sign together, he will draw a chicken. And the chicken is saying, "Amen." So I said to each and every one of you, you must never, ever give up. Must never, ever get lost in the sea of despair. You must keep the faith. Be hopeful. Be optimistic. Be happy. Enjoy life. And let's do what we can to save this little piece of real estate we call Earth. Not just for this generation, but for generation yet unborn. We can do it, and we must do it. Thank you very much.
How do you follow that? My name is Andrew Aydin. I serve as the Congressman's Digital Director and Policy Advisor in Washington, D.C., and I'm the co-author of March. I'm sure at some point before you came here today, you asked yourself, why did John Lewis decide to write a graphic novel? And it's my fault. It started in 2008. It was the summer of hope and change. Barack Obama was sweeping through the Democratic primaries. And I went to serve on Congressman Lewis's re-election campaign as his press secretary. And it was coming down to the end of the campaign. The congressman was trouncing his two opponents. And those of us on the staff were starting to talk about what we were going to do afterwards. Some folks said, "I'm going to go to the beach." Other folks said, "I'm going to go visit my parents." I said, I'm going to go to a comic book convention. As you can imagine, the uptight world of politics, I got laughed at for saying that, except one person did not laugh. It was John Lewis, and from the back of the room he said, "Do not laugh, there was a comic book during the Civil Rights Movement." And it was incredibly influential. That comic book was called Martin Luther King and the Montgomery Story. It sold for 10 cents. It was 16 pages, cover to cover, published by an organization called the Fellowship of Reconciliation. I didn't know much about it at the time, but once he told me, I went and I looked it up on the internet, I read it. It was about the Montgomery bus boycotts. It was an introduction to Gandhi, the philosophy and discipline of nonviolence. And it struck me. Here I was, a lifelong comics fan. I've been reading comics since I was 5 years old. Truth be told, I started reading comics after my dad left because it was a refuge. It was a place to read stories about justice, about role models and heroes who fought for the right thing for no other reason than it was the right thing to do. And so, having done that, having read that my whole life, and seeing John Lewis and seeing that a comic book had played a meaningful role in the civil rights movement, I couldn't help myself. Here was a man who had been a part of almost every seminal moment of the civil rights movement. He had sat in Nashville. He'd been a freedom rider. He'd been chair of SNCC and helped lead the March on Washington. He'd helped lead the Mississippi Freedom Summer. And ultimately, he'd co-led the March on Bloody Sunday. So I was 24 years old. I did not know any better. And I started asking the congressman, the icon, John Lewis, "Why don't you write a comic book?" And at first, he said, "Oh, well, maybe." Which, if you ever have a chance to work in politics, you will quickly find that maybe is a very kind way of saying no. But I couldn't give up on the idea. It meant so much to me. He meant so much to me. I grew up in Atlanta. He's been my congressman since I was 3 years old, and yet, having gone, yeah, that's right. My mother still doesn't believe it. And yet, having grown up in Atlanta, having heard so much about the civil rights movement, nobody ever taught me about SNCC. Nobody ever taught me about the role of young people. That really and truly, they were the linchpin. They were what pushed radical reforms into the mainstream. That they made the movement work. They were the glue. And so I kept asking, "John Lewis, why don't you write a comic book?" And people kept laughing. And I kept asking. Until finally one day, John Lewis turned around to me and he said, "Okay, let's do it. But only if you write it with me." And that day changed my life. So I say to you today, if people are laughing at you, you're probably doing something right. But that was just the beginning. How do you go from having a congressman say, "Okay, I'll do it," to actually getting a book put together and published? Well, it took us 5 years. Congressman obviously has a day job. I'm on his staff. I did too. And so it meant every night, every weekend, when people would go see their family, when people would go out, relax, see a movie, we would go back to work. I told the kids the other day, "You think homework's bad? Try that." In the meantime, I also decided to go back to grad school as if things weren't hard enough. And I went and I wrote my graduate thesis on Martin Luther King and the Montgomery story. I wanted to know the history. And what I found, it proved to me that we were on the right path. It turns out Dr. King actually helped edit that comic book. Can you imagine? Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., comic book editor. But there he was in the fall of 1957 poring over a comic script. And in fact, his edits made it into the final version. And so the congressman patiently worked with me for months that became years. It was a surreal journey. Early on, the congressman invited me to go along on the pilgrimage, which is where he leads members of Congress down to Alabama, shows them the sights, tells them the stories. And I got into an elevator, and there was John Siegenthaler, Robert Kennedy's aide, and later the publisher of the Nashville Tennessean, and Ethel Kennedy, Robert Kennedy's widow. And I couldn't help myself. "Oh my gosh, excuse me, I just thought you'd want to know. You're in a comic book that I'm working on with John Lewis." And Ethel Kennedy looks up at me with those big, beautiful eyes, and she says, "Well, that's nice, dear." So you can understand what it meant to me when a few years later she called me on my cell phone to tell me that March Book One was the first graphic novel ever to win the Robert F. Kennedy Book Award. But that wasn't the moment we realized that we were well on our way to inspiring a new generation. That moment came just before Book One came out. I got a phone call from a reporter at a conservative newspaper that shall remain nameless. And he said, "Look, I don't usually do this, but I gave your book to my 9-year-old son. And he's read it. And then he went and put on his Sunday suit. And now he's marching around my house demanding equality for everyone." Imagine if we existed in a world where there was a social consciousness in every 9-year-old. In a generation, the injustice we see would no longer be tolerated. But it's not just that. We don't teach the civil rights movement. Teaching Tolerance puts out a report every couple of years that looks at the quality of civil rights education in this country. And it's nothing but bad news. 34 states get a D or an F. Another 13 get a C. 3 states do it okay. That's it. How can you understand what is happening in this country if you don't understand the civil rights movement? So much of our politics stem from that vital decade. So much legislation, so much activism, so much hope. Everything comes from that. We have to change that. We call it the 10-word problem. Kids graduate from high school knowing 10 words about the civil rights movement. Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, I have a dream. That's it. But we're changing that. In 2 years, March is being taught in schools in more than 40 states. It's been used in freshman reading programs in more than a dozen universities. And the congressman is giving his all. He's going around the country, he's talking to students. He's explaining his life story. And it's important that they see him. It's important that they see he is a real human being, someone that they can emulate. In this society today, civility is sorely lacking. And no human being more fully represents that than John Lewis. In the congressional office, I help with the congressman's social media. In a sense, I tweet for a living. It's part of my job, but it's a very serious part. Because social media represents a fundamental change in the way we interact with each other and with our elected officials. One of the things I like to ask students when we go to these schools is, what would Dr. King have tweeted? What would Gandhi have posted? How would they have used these tools? I think right now we're seeing a generation of armchair activists. People like to talk and complain and voice their opinions on social media, but they're not using it to organize and to show up to the full extent of its possibilities. And we're starting to see growth. But that's why March is so important. It lays out the principles of nonviolence, how another generation did it. We focus on communications. We focus on the mimeograph machines and the small tools that they were able to use to such great effect to show this generation how to use those principles to achieve even greater results. And they're getting there. We've had students engage in sustained campaigns of civil disobedience after we visited their schools. We've had students email and say that they're organizing. We see the passion that they have. I mean, once they start reading, they want to know. They want to know what they can do. So we'll get there. Where do I think we should start? I think we have to start with student loans. There is so much wrong in this country. We need an activist generation. We have to get rid of the student loan debt so that the students can be those activists. Because it's not the only problem. Certainly not. But that allows us to create an activist generation. Let me put it a different way. When John Lewis got married in 1968, the wedding announcement read, Lily and Miles to wed unemployed political activist John Lewis. People who are ahead of their time pay a price. We must lift the burden of debt so that this generation is free to pay the price to build a more perfect union. I'll tell you one more story. When I was a kid, and I was in high school, I brought comic books to my English class. And my English teacher took them away. She said they weren't real books and they shouldn't be on my desk. Well, I had the opportunity to go back to my high school with Congressman Lewis and see my English teacher and discuss her experiences teaching our graphic novels. I say that as no form of comeuppance to the teacher because she's doing the Lord's work. She is a teacher. She deserves a Nobel Peace Prize for putting up with us students every day. But I say it as an example of the power of an idea whose time has come and the brief time span in which change is possible. So I ask you, join us. March. Thank you. Take some questions. Should we have time to take a few questions? I think there's a mic. Yep.
Congressman Lewis, I would like to ask you a question about a guy I know from my synagogue. He's an activist. He calls himself an activist. He does go to protests and stuff, and he's progressive, but he refuses to register to vote. And I would like to know how I can convince him to vote. He says he's followed the money of both parties and they're both corrupt. But I told him it's the basic civil right.
Well, you tell him.
Talking to the mic.
Just tell your friend that I would strongly suggest that he register and vote. The vote is the most powerful nonviolent instrument or tool we have in a democratic society, and we should use it.
Yeah.
And you should further say, I met this guy named John Lewis who said he gave a little blood on that bridge for the right to vote, and we have to vote. You fail to vote, you don't have a voice. You can't complain. Thank you.
Thank you both for writing these books. Amongst other things, it gives us the honor of hearing from you. But my question is, what was more difficult for you, the hard work on the chicken farm or serving on the Benghazi committee?
Well, as a staffer, I'll point out, John Lewis does not serve on House Oversight. That's Elijah Cummings. But I think, look, the partisanship in Washington is too far. And the important part of John Lewis's story is that he's above that. He is an example of what it is to see forgiveness and to work together with people of different ideologies. And I wouldn't have given my 20s on this project and in spreading his story if it wasn't worth it, if it wasn't crucial to the future of our democracy. He is everything, and his example is something we all must follow. And so you're right, that was too far, that was too much. But I hope what it pointed out to the American people is that we all have to rise above it and follow John Lewis' example of forgiveness, and to show that you can't spell love without you can't spell revolution without love. Love is the highest virtue in this country, and it must be honored as such. So thank you.
No, thank you.
Congressman Lewis, I just wanted to say that there was absolutely no need for the couple who introduced you to request a standing ovation from this Miami Book Fair audience.
Thank you.
Okay. Congressman Lewis, in light of your vast contributions in the civil rights Congressman Lewis, in light of your vast contributions in the civil rights movement, just twofold question. One, what is your views of Black Lives Matter? And the second would be, what would be one of your favorite books that you've read that you would highly recommend that other people read that's had a significant impact upon you?
Well, I think the young people that are engaged in the work of Black Lives Matter are following in a very rich tradition. But when you see something that is not fair, not right, not just, you have to speak up and speak out and find a way to get in the way, to get in trouble, good trouble, to help educate, to help inform, and to inspire. I think in America today we're just too quiet. I think we're too quiet.
And one of your favorite books that you've read that you would highly recommend other people read that's had a significant
Well,
impact
there's
on
several books. Well, read March by all means.
yeah.
Thomas Merton.
Thomas Merton. Thomas Merton. When I was marching on that bridge from Selma to Montgomery, I was wearing a backpack before it became fashionable to wear backpacks. And in that backpack, I had two books. One was The History of Political Tradition by a Harvard professor, and a book by Thomas Merton on contemplation. Before going on a march, before sitting in, before going on a freedom ride, before walking across that bridge, some of us have what I call an executive session with ourselves. You prepare yourself. I thought I was going to die. So you read and you get the necessary energy and the necessary strength. I thought I was going to be arrested and jailed, but I was beaten. I had a concussion on that bridge. I thought I saw death. So sometimes just reading books, poems, essays. There are plenty of good books out there.
Thank you.
Hi. I have a question. You know how water, let's say we have a huge pipe and water's shooting down it, right? Pretty strong force, good force. Okay, and then if you have pipes, smaller pipes coming off of it, the pressure and the speed of the water is going to go down because it's getting diluted, right? So in the 60s, you say civil rights, and the first thing I think of is African American civil rights, you know, changing the system. The focus of all African Americans and many other American citizens, the contribution of the media, television, how everything came together to do that, made a tectonic shift, just changed everything. Okay, so when I hear you say today, we must continue civil rights, and you start off and you say, for example, student loans, right? Here's my thing. When you take on a lot of things, to me, sometimes you lose efficacy, you know, and your strength is weakened. So when you say civil rights, like, do you think you can do many things parallel, or do you think there's an order so that, I don't know if you can understand what I'm saying.
I understand what you're saying. I think the reason we start with student loans is because it allows an entire generation to find their voice. Because, let me put it this way, if John Lewis had to go pay student debt after he graduated, remember, he missed his graduation because he was in Parchment Farm during the Freedom Rides.
In jail.
In jail. He was in prison. There would have been no Civil Rights Act. There would have been no Voting Rights Act because he would have had to go work.
Right.
Right? How many progressive reforms are we missing out on because this generation, the next John Lewis, has to go serve that debt rather than serve this society?
Right, correct.
Right? So let me put it another way. The March on Washington, I mean, we label these things civil rights, but the March on Washington called for a minimum wage that is equivalent of $15 an hour today. right? These are
Right.
fundamental human rights efforts.
Right.
And the language of the civil rights movement has been co-opted. You had the Freedom Summer, you had the Freedom Rides, you had the Freedom Vote, and now you have the Freedom Caucus that stands for nothing,
Right,
like the Freedom Vote or the Freedom Movement did.
right.
Right? And it was about so much to so many people. So I think they didn't focus on just one thing. We can't limit ourselves. But the reason I say we start with student loans is because we need a whole generation.
No, exactly. But when I hear you say, talk about civil rights for everything, okay.
Thank you for your question.
Thank you.
Congressman Lewis, would you say that the civil rights movement has merged into the progressive political movement completely? And if it is not completely merged into the progressive political movement, what would you say, or what would you enumerate are the remaining goals of the civil rights movement that need to be accomplished?
I think part of our politics had tried to catch up with the civil rights movement. We still have a great distance to travel because of the Supreme Court decision on the Voting Rights Act. More than 30 states have changed their voting laws, making it harder and more difficult, not just for people of color, but for young people, for our senior citizens. My position here, open up the political process and let everybody come in. When I spoke at the March on Washington on August 28, 1963, when I was 23 years old, had all of my hair and a few pounds lighter, I said, one person, one vote. And today, money is controlling American politics. As a great nation, as a great people, we can do better. We can do much better. Make it easy. Make it simple.
So you're going to have to be the last question. I'm so sorry. But tweet us, and we'll answer you on social media. Is that cool? All right. Thank you.
Congressman Lewis, you're one of my heroes, and in 5th grade you signed my cast when I came to your office. And I've quoted you when you said hate is too heavy a burden to bear. Could you give us some practical tips on how to put it down?
Well, I can't say it in this audience, but I heard Dr. King say on one occasion, and maybe I can paraphrase him and let him take the hit. No, he said, just love everybody. Just love the hell out of everybody. Just love is a better way. Just love everybody. Why should we go around putting someone down because of the color of their skin, their religion, or sexual orientation, or the part of the world they come from? Is it possible for us as human beings to come to that point, to emerge, to grow, where we can be just a little more human? When I was raising chicken, I prayed for some of those chickens. I would teach those chickens. I said, don't fight. You be kind. And I would tell them, I said, you listen to me. So if little creatures can get along, why can't we, as humans, just emerge and be kind to everybody?
Thank you.